The sun was beginning its slow descent over the dusty streets of Dry Creek when the stranger rode into town, a solitary figure cloaked in shadow and dust. His horse was lean and tired, its hooves stirring up small clouds of dirt that lingered in the still air. Townsfolk paused in mid-step, hats in hands, mouths open in silent surprise. They hadn't seen him before. A man new to Dry Creek was always noticed, but there was something about him that set hearts racing and palms sweating. He didn't wave. He didn't call a greeting. He simply rode straight down Main Street, head low beneath a battered hat, eyes hidden in the shadow of its brim, as if surveying a world he already knew too well. The Red Lantern Saloon sat at the corner, its weathered sign swinging gently in the breeze, paint flaking and wood warped from years of sun and storm. The stranger dismounted with a quiet precision, tying his horse to the post and swinging the door open with a subtle push. The swing of the door caused the piano to falter mid-note, and for a heartbeat everything in the saloon froze. The card players paused their hands over the table. The bartender stopped wiping down the counter, and even the ceiling fan seemed to slow as if holding its breath. He approached the bar in deliberate steps, each one measured, careful, and when he reached the counter, he leaned slightly, resting a hand on the polished wood. "Whiskey. Neat," he said in a voice that was calm, yet carried a weight that made people instinctively step back. The bartender, a tall man named Jed, poured it silently, sliding the glass across the bar without a word. The stranger caught it without glancing down, tipped it back in a single motion and set the glass down. Then he looked around. The eyes, just visible beneath the shadow of his hat, were sharp, assessing, scanning the room as if weighing every single soul present. Townsfolk whispered to each other, and the tension was palpable. A stranger like this didn't just come to Dry Creek for a drink. There was history in the way he carried himself. A story etched in the lines of his face, in the set of his shoulders, in the cold glint of his eyes. And then, the door opened again, swinging wide, letting in a rush of warm evening air and three men who immediately drew attention. The first man was tall, broad-shouldered, with a jagged scar running down his cheek. The other two were shorter, but equally imposing, their hands resting casually near the grips of their pistols. "Well, well," the tall man said, voice rough and filled with a mixture of recognition and challenge. "Look what's come back to town." He stepped forward, boots scuffing against the wooden floor. The stranger didn't move, didn't flinch. His eyes lifted just enough to meet the man's gaze, calm and unyielding. "You got the wrong man," the stranger said softly. His tone carried authority but not arrogance. "Just a statement of fact." The tall man laughed, sharp and bitter. "Wrong man? Funny. You sure look like someone I used to know, back before you vanished, back before you left a trail of bodies in your wake." The room went silent again. Sutter, the piano player, tried to shift his chair to the corner, hoping to avoid attention. The other patrons froze, knives and forks halfway to mouths, cigarettes paused mid-air. The stranger's hand moved slowly, deliberately, brushing his coat. "I told you," he said. "You're mistaken, am I?" The scarred man stepped closer, and the room seemed to contract around them. "Because Copper Creek remembers you. Dead men remember you." Then in an instant the tension snapped. The stranger's hand shot out faster than any eye could follow. A flash, a gunshot, and the first man went down with a scream, hitting the floor with a heavy thud. His companions went for their guns, but the stranger moved again. Two more shots rang out, precise, deadly, echoing across the walls. When the smoke cleared, the three men were lying on the floor, their faces frozen in shock and fear. The saloon remained silent. The piano was quiet. The patrons' hearts pounded in their chests. The stranger holstered his weapon, straightened, and poured another glass of whiskey, drinking it slowly as if nothing had happened. "Apologies," he said softly, almost politely, and then he turned, stepping back toward the door. Without another word, he disappeared into the evening, boots kicking up dust, leaving nothing behind but whispers and fear. By the time the sheriff arrived, called urgently by witnesses, the stranger was gone. Sheriff Dalton wasn't an easily rattled man, but even he had to pause at the sight inside the Red Lantern. The three men lay sprawled across the floor, their guns still in hand, and the saloon smelled of gunpowder and spilled whiskey. He shook his head, muttering, "Christ almighty." Who was he? The patrons had stories, theories, names, and every version was stranger than the last. Some claimed he was a bounty hunter, sent by some distant marshal to clean up old scores. Others whispered he was a ghost, a man returned from the dead to settle debts unfinished. And a few, the more superstitious ones, swore he was an avenging spirit, sent to punish those who had wronged the innocent long ago. None of it could explain the calm way he moved, the certainty in his eyes, or the efficiency of his actions. The sheriff examined the bullet casings, turning them over carefully. Custom-made rounds, he noted, hand-engraved. Whoever this man was, he wasn't just another gunslinger. He had skill, precision, and purpose. Sheriff Dalton's deputy, a young man named Rowe, leaned over. "Do you think he was military, sir?" Dalton frowned. "Could be," he said. "Or maybe something worse." But he knew exactly what he was doing. That much is clear. By morning, Red Creek buzzed with speculation. Rumors spread like wildfire, filling every corner of the town. The stranger's reputation grew before anyone even knew his name. Some townsfolk refused to step outside, afraid of encountering him again. Others stayed glued to the saloon, hoping to catch another glimpse. No one did. Meanwhile, Sheriff Dalton began retracing the stranger's steps. Outside the town at a watering trough, he found the tracks of a single horse leading north. But mixed with them were smaller, lighter tracks, footprints indicating that the stranger had a companion or someone observing him closely. Dalton followed the trail, deeper into the canyon roads that twisted like a serpent through the dry hills. Hours passed, the sun baking down, until he found signs of a recent camp. The fire still warm, footprints fresh. Among the ashes lay a torn scrap of parchment, partially burned. Dalton brushed the soot away and found a few words clearly visible. "Clock strikes 8. The place. Tell no one." He folded it, staring at the words. Whoever the stranger was, he had plans. A meeting. A mission. And it wasn't random. Dalton felt a shiver run down his spine. The stranger had come to Dry Creek with purpose, and it was tied to events long forgotten. Events Dalton barely understood himself. By dusk, Dalton had returned to town with a sense of unease. He kept the finding secret from the townspeople. They were already frightened enough. But he couldn't shake the thought that this stranger's arrival wasn't an accident, and that what happened tonight might ripple out far beyond Red Creek, reaching into towns and territories he had no jurisdiction over. As the night deepened, a lone rider was seen moving across the horizon. Fast, silent, deliberate. Some said it was the stranger, still on his mission. Others swore it was a ghost, a harbinger of something that Dry Creek wasn't ready for. But Sheriff Dalton knew deep in his bones that the stranger wasn't just passing through. He had unfinished business, and sooner or later that business would bring him back. And when he returned, it wouldn't be for gossip. It wouldn't be for whiskey. It would be for something far more dangerous, far more personal. A reckoning that no one in Dry Creek would ever forget. By the time dawn cracked over Dry Creek, Sheriff Dalton was already on horseback, following the faint trail left by the stranger. The town had begun to stir, but most of the people stayed indoors, whispering rumors behind shutters and curtains. The sun cast long shadows over the dusty main street, making every ordinary object look strange and threatening. Dalton's eyes scanned the horizon as he rode north, tracing the path the stranger's horse had taken, disturbed patches of dust marking a deliberate yet hurried route. Something about the way the tracks veered off toward the canyon road suggested intent, almost like a predator stalking its prey. The canyon itself was quiet, save for the occasional caw of a raven circling overhead and the rustle of dry grass in the morning breeze. Dalton's horse picked its way carefully along the rocky slope, hooves clicking against stone. In the shadows of the cliffs, he found signs that someone had camped there recently. A patch of flattened earth, scraps of paper blackened by fire, and a faint trail of footprints leading further into the ridge. Dalton dismounted and knelt beside a charred scrap of parchment, brushing away soot to reveal part of a message. "When the clock strikes 8, tell no one." The words were precise, written in careful, deliberate handwriting. The edges burned as if to conceal the full message. Dalton felt a chill run down his spine. Whoever had written this knew the terrain intimately, and they were planning something dangerous. The sheriff followed the trail cautiously. The path narrowed as it wound through the canyon, forcing him to ride single file and stay alert. Every rock, every crevice could hide someone waiting, and he felt the tension of invisible eyes tracking his movement. Hours passed, the sun rising higher, turning the canyon into a furnace of heat and light. And then he saw it. A makeshift camp nestled behind a boulder, almost invisible from the trail. The fire had been recently extinguished, smoke faint in the morning air. Footprints circled the area, some leading away, some staying behind, deliberate patterns signaling someone had been careful not to leave too much evidence. Dalton scanned the camp, noting provisions, a blanket rolled neatly in one corner, and a small worn satchel tucked under the rocks. Inside the satchel, Dalton found more clues. Maps marked with towns, names, and specific routes. A small notebook with shorthand notes referencing incidents that had occurred years ago in Dry Creek and neighboring towns. And, most strangely, a badge partially buried beneath the sack. The badge was old, tarnished, and unmistakably a lawman's insignia. Dalton picked it up slowly, studying it. Whoever had been here had once carried authority, perhaps even been a sheriff or deputy themselves. The handwriting in the notebook, precise and measured, suggested intelligence, strategy, and planning. This wasn't a common outlaw passing through. This was someone methodical, someone seeking justice on a scale far larger than a simple bounty. Dalton returned to Dry Creek with a sense of urgency. He spoke quietly with Deputy Rowe, careful to keep the townsfolk from knowing too much. "We're not dealing with an ordinary gunslinger," Dalton said. "This man, he knows the law, he's been trained, and he's working a plan that could affect more than just this town." Rowe swallowed uneasy. "You mean he's like a lawman gone rogue?" Dalton nodded slowly. "Something like that. But not rogue in the criminal sense. He's after something, someone, and we need to understand who or what before it's too late." That evening, Dalton went back to the Red Lantern Saloon. The atmosphere was thick with tension. Patrons avoided the windows, speaking in hushed tones, glancing at shadows as if expecting the stranger to return. Dalton examined the spot where the killings had occurred the night before, tracing the dust and bullet marks. He noted something odd. Subtle scratches along the bar edge, marks that suggested someone had leaned or crouched there while surveying the room. The stranger had been precise, almost surgical, and yet Dalton sensed that there was more to the story than just skill. There was history. Dalton questioned the locals discreetly, asking about odd sightings in the days leading up to the stranger's arrival. A ranch hand mentioned seeing a figure riding along the northern ridge at dawn, long before anyone else was awake. A shopkeeper had glimpsed a man quietly observing the town from the hills to the west, always alone, always silent, and a woman working the stables swore she had seen someone speaking briefly to the traveling preacher who had come through Dry Creek months ago, though no one else had noticed. Dalton began to connect the dots. The stranger's actions weren't random. They were tied to a long-forgotten series of events, betrayals, thefts, and deaths that had haunted this part of the territory for years. As night fell, Dalton decided to follow the trail once more, deeper into the canyon and toward a ridge that overlooked the town. The wind had picked up, carrying the scent of sagebrush and dust, and the shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally. Dalton spotted flattened grass and footprints leading toward a small mining shack that had been abandoned for years. The door hung loosely on its hinges, creaking in the wind. Inside he found clear signs of recent habitation, a fire pit with cold embers, a blanket neatly folded in the corner, and small personal items left as if the occupant had only just stepped away. He picked up a scrap of paper with a date and a series of initials, notes referencing Dry Creek, Copper Creek, and other towns where violence had once erupted. The stranger had history here. The stranger had plans. Dalton realized the pieces were falling into place. This was a man who had once served the law, who had vanished under mysterious circumstances and who now returned not as a criminal but as a seeker of justice. And the people he had confronted in the saloon? They weren't merely criminals. They were connected to old feuds, old betrayals, and events that had left scars across multiple towns. Dalton understood that the danger was real, and that the stranger's mission would inevitably bring conflict back to Dry Creek. By the following morning, Dalton had secured a small group of trusted townsfolk and began monitoring the approaches to Dry Creek. Every movement in the distance, every sound in the wind was scrutinized. He could feel the tension pressing down on the town, the quiet before a storm, and he couldn't shake the feeling that the stranger was already watching, always one step ahead, orchestrating events from the shadows, waiting for the clock to strike 8 as the burned note had said. The sheriff reflected on what he had learned. The stranger was no ordinary man, no mere outlaw passing through. He was calculated, experienced, and tied deeply to the law he had once served, or perhaps the law he had failed to uphold. Dry Creek was a small town, but in the stranger's eyes, it was a chessboard, a place where old scores were about to be settled, and Dalton was caught in the middle, unsure whether to intervene or simply observe. And as night fell over the dusty streets, the wind carrying the faint scent of smoke and distant pine, Dalton realized something chilling. The stranger's return to Dry Creek was only the beginning. The past was coming back to life, and the town, and perhaps Dalton himself, would have to confront secrets long buried. Every shadow could conceal a threat, every footstep could signal danger, and every heartbeat might be counted down to a confrontation that no one in Dry Creek would survive unscathed. The next morning, Sheriff Dalton woke with the canyon wind still whispering through the wooden shutters of his office. Sleep had come only fitfully, dreams of shadows and gunfire dancing in his mind. He knew the stranger was out there, somewhere in the hills, and he understood one immutable fact. This man was no ordinary gunslinger. Every clue, every footprint, every burned scrap of parchment pointed to something far deeper than a simple vendetta. And Dalton, despite his years in law enforcement, realized he had no idea what he was truly up against. By mid-morning, he mounted his horse and rode toward the northern ridge, the path the stranger had taken the previous night. Dust swirled around his boots as he ascended the rocky trail, and his eyes scanned every slope, every crevice, every shadow. The ridge offered a vantage point over the town, and Dalton could see Dry Creek spread below like a miniature map. The saloon, the general store, the stables, each building a potential stage for the stranger's next move, and he realized with a cold nod of fear that the stranger didn't just move through the town. He studied it. He calculated it. He owned it before anyone even knew he had arrived. Dalton reached the top of the ridge and dismounted. He noticed the ground was disturbed as though someone had crouched there recently. Scrapes in the dirt suggested someone had been studying the town from this very spot. And then he saw a flash of metal caught in the sunlight. He moved closer, careful, and discovered a spyglass mounted atop a rock. He peered through it. At first, the view was empty, but then he noticed a lone figure moving along the outskirts of the town, following his route exactly as he had earlier. This wasn't coincidence. The stranger was tracking him, watching, waiting. Dalton's thoughts churned. Whoever this man was, he had a past intertwined with law and order, but also with vengeance. And the more Dalton pieced together the clues, the clearer it became. The stranger had enemies, and those enemies were still alive. The men in the saloon weren't random targets. They were remnants of a network tied to years of betrayal and corruption. Dalton could trace back their history. Copper Creek, a raid gone wrong. A sheriff's office infiltrated by men who had sold out their posts, leaving law-abiding men dead and towns in ruins. And the stranger, Dalton realized, had been left behind in the dust, forced into hiding, planning his return with painstaking precision. By afternoon, Dalton found himself at the abandoned mining shack on the ridge. The place had been empty yesterday, but today signs of activity suggested someone had returned. Footprints led around the structure in careful looping patterns as though someone had been circling, waiting. Dalton examined the area carefully. Broken twigs, scuff marks in the dirt, an overturned tin cup, and a faded piece of cloth that bore a strange emblem, a spiral intertwined with a star. Dalton crouched, running his fingers over the mark. He recognized it from old records. A secret badge used by a group of lawmen tasked with rooting out corruption decades ago. The stranger had belonged to it. The pieces fell into place. A man once sworn to uphold the law, betrayed, cast aside, forced to disappear, and now returned to exact justice on his own terms. Dalton felt a chill as he realized what this meant for Dry Creek. The town had unknowingly sheltered dangerous men under its roof, men who had thrived under corruption and violence. and who had now been marked for retribution. And the stranger had no interest in public perception. He wasn't here to negotiate or explain. He was here to enforce a code that had long been forgotten. Dalton's pulse quickened. Every step the stranger took was deliberate. Every confrontation in the saloon had been a warning, and Dalton feared that the next encounter would be far deadlier. By evening, Dalton returned to the town in secret. He moved quietly through the streets, noting how the townsfolk were acting. There was a nervous energy in the air, subtle glances toward the hills, whispered questions behind doors, the restless shuffling of boots. The presence of the stranger, though unseen, had already altered their behavior. Dalton knew that when the stranger came back, he wouldn't merely visit the saloon. He would confront someone with purpose, and Dalton needed to know who. Inside the Red Lantern Saloon, Dalton examined the bullet marks and the floors where the men had fallen. The three men hadn't been mere thugs. Their stance, their movements, even the way their pistols had been drawn suggested training, experience, and familiarity with deadly encounters. They had faced danger before, and yet they had fallen to the stranger's hand. Dalton studied the scene for hours, imagining the sequence of events, trying to understand the man who had done this. He realized, with a mixture of awe and fear, that the stranger's skill wasn't just in gunfighting. It was in observation, in anticipation, in knowing the exact moment to act. Late that night, Dalton convened with Deputy Rowe and a few trusted townsfolk. He laid out what he had discovered: the footprint trail, the spyglass, the emblem in the mining shack, the connections to Copper Creek. The group listened in tense silence. Dalton's words painted a picture of a man who had once been law, who had vanished, and who now returned to settle unfinished business. The realization hung heavy in the room. "He's not just passing through," Dalton said quietly. "He's coming back, and when he does, Dry Creek won't be ready." The sheriff and his deputies decided to set a watch along the northern ridge and the outskirts of town. They took shifts, scanning the hills for movement, listening for the faintest sound of hooves or footsteps. Hours stretched into a long, tense night, punctuated only by the cry of coyotes and the rustle of wind through dry grass. And then, in the early hours before dawn, Dalton saw it, a lone figure moving deliberately across the ridge, approaching the town from the north. The silhouette was unmistakable, tall, steady, confident, moving with a purpose that spoke of knowledge, experience, and a mission. Dalton's breath caught. This was the stranger. He had returned. Dalton watched as the stranger approached the outskirts, pausing only to survey the town from a distance. There was no sign of hesitation, no sign of doubt. Every step was measured, every glance calculated. And then the stranger disappeared briefly behind a ridge, only to reappear moments later closer to the town, now moving toward the abandoned warehouse on the edge of Main Street. Dalton realized the man had an objective. He wasn't here for random targets or petty revenge. He had a specific goal, and Dalton knew that anyone standing in his way would face the consequences. As the first light of dawn touched the rooftops of Dry Creek, Dalton made a decision. He would follow, but carefully. He couldn't confront the stranger directly without understanding his motive, without knowing the history that had brought this man back to life. He followed the trail silently, moving from shadow to shadow, witnessing the stranger's meticulous method of observation, the way he paused to examine corners, doors, windows, and roots. Dalton could see now that the stranger had a plan, a target, and the knowledge to carry it out with lethal precision. By mid-morning, Dalton caught up to the stranger near an old stone bridge on the outskirts of town. The man was crouched, examining the ground as if searching for something. Dalton approached quietly, keeping to the shadows. "Stop," Dalton called. The stranger didn't flinch immediately. Slowly he turned, eyes calm, cold, and calculating. Dalton could see now the full weight of the man's presence, the aura of authority, the years of experience, the subtle menace that radiated from someone who had walked the line between law and lawlessness for longer than most could endure. "You've been following me," the stranger said quietly, almost a statement of fact rather than accusation. Dalton raised a hand, keeping his voice measured. "I need to know who you are, why you're here, and what you want from Dry Creek." The stranger's eyes flicked toward the town, and then back at Dalton. "I am what Dry Creek needs," he said, "though it doesn't yet know it. And I've come for those who betrayed it, those who hid behind badges, behind authority, behind lies. They think they've escaped justice. They're wrong." Dalton felt the weight of those words. This was no ordinary man. This was a lawman returned from the shadows, carrying the authority of a code that had long been forgotten. Dalton lowered his gaze briefly, weighing his next words carefully. "If that's true," he said finally, "then you won't have to work alone. But you must let me help. We can't risk the town getting caught in the crossfire." The stranger studied him silently, and for a long moment the wind whistled through the canyon. Then he nodded once, slow and deliberate, as though agreeing to a truce based on mutual understanding rather than trust. Dalton knew then that Dry Creek was about to witness a reckoning unlike any it had seen. The stranger had returned, his motives clear, his methods precise, and his target set. The town had unknowingly sheltered corruption, and now the ghost of justice, carried in the form of a man who had disappeared years ago, had come back to set things right. The town of Dry Creek was eerily quiet as the morning sun crested over the horizon. Sheriff Dalton and the stranger, side by side but still cautious, approached the edge of town, the air thick with tension and the smell of dust and spent gunpowder from previous skirmishes. The streets, usually filled with the chatter of townsfolk and the clip-clop of horse hooves, were empty, as if the town itself were holding its breath. Dalton glanced at the stranger. "We need to know who we're facing," he said quietly. The stranger's eyes scanned the buildings, calculating every possible angle of approach. "You will soon," he replied, voice low and steady. "But first, we clean the past." The first stop was the Red Lantern Saloon. The stranger moved inside with the calm precision of a predator, observing every corner, every shadow. Dalton followed, careful to stay in the back, aware that the three men who had died there the night before were just a fragment of the web the stranger intended to unravel. In the saloon, Dalton spotted familiar faces, men who had prospered under corruption, who had taken advantage of townspeople, who had hidden crimes behind friendly smiles and polite conversation. These men, the stranger explained, were the reason he had returned. They were his targets, and justice would not wait for law books or courts. As the stranger confronted the first of them, Dalton realized something remarkable. The man moved with a sense of authority that went beyond any ordinary lawman. He knew exactly how to control the situation, how to force truth from fear without unnecessary bloodshed. His presence demanded attention. He asked questions, not accusations, and yet every answer seemed to tighten the web around those who had hidden in shadows for far too long. Men confessed things they had thought buried, crimes that had been whispered only in fear of exposure, and Dalton, standing quietly behind him, began to understand the stranger's methods. Justice was not about punishment alone. It was about revelation, about forcing people to see the consequences of their choices. By midday, the stranger had gathered the remaining targets in the main square, using both strategy and intimidation to corral them without endangering the townsfolk. Dalton watched, impressed despite himself, as the stranger laid bare a network of deceit, theft, and violence that had plagued Dry Creek for decades. Each revelation was a blow to the corrupt, and yet the stranger treated the town's innocent with respect, shielding them from the ugliness of truth. Dalton could feel the weight of the past lifting from the town, and he realized that the stranger's work was more than vengeance. It was restoration. The final confrontation came at the outskirts of town, near the abandoned mining shack where Dalton had first found clues to the stranger's identity. Here, the last of the corrupt men made a desperate attempt to flee, guns drawn, hearts pounding with fear and defiance. The stranger confronted them with an unflinching gaze. "It ends here," he said simply. One by one, the men dropped their weapons, understanding that there was no escape from the reckoning. Dalton stepped forward, helping to secure them, while the stranger watched, eyes sharp, calculating the moment when the law would take hold. After the final confessions, the stranger turned to Dalton. "You see now," he said, "why I had to return." Dalton nodded. "I do," But who are you, really? The stranger hesitated, then removed his hat, letting the sun illuminate a face weathered by years of experience, sacrifice, and solitude. I was once a lawman, he said, voice steady. Like you, but I was betrayed, left for dead, and forced to vanish. I've spent years tracking those who escaped justice, and now the debts have been paid. Dalton studied him carefully. There was a calm, unshakable authority in the man's eyes, a sense that the world could shake and crumble and he would still stand, unwavering until the balance had been restored. With the corrupt men confined and the town beginning to breathe again, Dalton realized that Dry Creek had been given a second chance. The stranger's presence had been a storm that swept away the rot, leaving the town cleaner, safer, and more aware of the fragile line between law and lawlessness. Dalton felt a quiet admiration for the man who had risked everything for a mission few could have understood. "What will you do now?" Dalton asked. The stranger smiled faintly, the corners of his mouth lifting in a rare expression of relief. "I vanish," he said simply. "My work here is done. Others will take up the law, guided by the truth we've revealed. My place is no longer here." Dalton felt a pang of loss knowing that the man had become more than an ally. He had become a guardian, a figure who had reminded the town of what true justice could look like. By nightfall, the stranger was gone. Dalton rode through the empty streets checking on the town and noticed subtle changes. Windows were open, shutters moved freely, the townsfolk emerging cautiously but with a new sense of hope. The Red Lantern Saloon, once a place of fear and shadows, was quiet but safe. Dalton knew that the stranger's presence had left an imprint, an invisible hand guiding the town toward vigilance and integrity. In the weeks that followed, Dry Creek recovered. The corrupt men were tried and punished, their influence stripped from the town. The townsfolk began to rebuild not only their homes but their trust in one another. Dalton, who had witnessed the stranger's methods firsthand, implemented new protocols, ensuring that justice would be served more fairly, more carefully, and without the shadows that had long haunted their streets. And though the stranger never returned, stories of him began to circulate, whispered tales of a man who appeared when the town needed him most, who acted with both skill and conscience, and who left as silently as he had arrived. One evening, as Dalton watched the sunset from the ridge overlooking Dry Creek, he spotted a lone figure riding along the horizon. For a fleeting moment he thought he recognized the silhouette, tall, steady, deliberate. But when he blinked, the figure was gone, swallowed by the hills. Dalton smiled quietly to himself, understanding that some legends exist not to be captured, but to inspire. The stranger had vanished once more, leaving behind a town renewed and a story that would be told for generations. And in the quiet of the night, when the wind rustled through the canyons and the stars shone bright over Dry Creek, the sheriff knew one undeniable truth. Justice, when carried with purpose and conviction, has a way of finding its mark, even when delivered by a stranger who isn't who anyone thought he was. The town slept safely, unaware that the man who had saved them was already riding toward the horizon, toward the next town, the next injustice, the next reckoning.